Have you ever found yourself explaining everything, only to realize no one is really listening? You say you're tired, and immediately you feel the urge to justify it. You say no to plans, and before the silence even settles, you're already offering a reason. You choose a quiet night alone, and somehow it feels like you owe the world an apology for it. Why is that? Why do you feel the need to defend your every decision, your every pause, your every breath? As if just existing requires permission. As if your presence, your silence, your space needs to be explained, to be valid. And slowly, almost without noticing, you begin asking for permission to simply be. It's exhausting, isn't it? This invisible weight you carry. The subtle panic in your chest when someone misunderstands you. The constant background noise in your head, whispering, they won't get it. You have to make them get it. Say it better. Soften it. Make it make sense. You're not alone in this. This isn't just a habit you picked up. It's a wound many of us carry silently. We were taught, maybe not with words, but with looks, with sighs, with absence, that being misunderstood meant being unlovable, that we had to shrink, smooth our edges, be agreeable, be easy, be explainable. And now, here you are, years later, turning your truth into arguments, your emotions into justifications, just trying to be seen, just trying to be enough. But what if I told you it's not your fault? What if this constant explaining wasn't a flaw in you, but a response to something deeper, something that started a long time ago, something that told you, you have to earn your space, you have to explain your pain, you have to justify who you are. You don't. You never did. There's a version of you beneath the rehearsed lines and careful tones that is tired of begging to be understood. A part of you that's whispering, enough. Enough apologizing for your needs. Enough softening your no into a maybe. Enough offering disclaimers before you speak your truth. Because you were never meant to live on trial. You were never meant to play the accused, the lawyer, and the judge in your own life every single day. You are not a problem to be solved. You are not a puzzle that needs explaining. You are not a burden that needs permission to breathe. So take a breath, and let this moment be the first time you choose not to explain. Not because you're hiding, not because you're shutting down, but because, maybe for the first time, you're beginning to understand. You don't need to be understood to be real. You don't need to be explained to be worthy. You don't need permission to exist as you are. This is where healing begins. Over-explaining isn't a personality trait. It's not just something you do. It's something you learned. It's a survival mechanism. Somewhere along the line, maybe early, maybe too early, you learned that silence was dangerous. That if you didn't explain yourself enough, if you didn't soften your words or justify your feelings, something would go wrong. You'd be left. Ignored. Misunderstood. Punished. So you adapted. You made yourself digestible, clear, pleasant, predictable. You learned how to read a room before you even walked into it. You anticipated disappointment before it arrived. You apologized before anyone got upset. And when they did, because they always did, you over-explained. Again and again, hoping this time they'd understand. It became automatic. You said things like, "I'm just tired." And then, without even thinking, added, "It's not you. Work's been overwhelming. I didn't sleep well. I'm okay, really." You cancelled plans and immediately followed it up with paragraphs of reassurance. You set a boundary and then spent hours wondering if you were too harsh, too distant, too much. But what if I told you that wasn't really you speaking? That voice, the one rushing to explain, to justify, to soften, isn't your truth. It's your fear. It's your nervous system reacting to the possibility of disconnection. It's the child in you still trying to be safe. Carl Jung once said, "What is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate." When we don't recognize the root of our behaviors, we repeat them thinking it's just who we are. But it's not who you are. It's what you needed to be in order to survive. And survival comes at a cost. The cost is your authenticity, your peace, your voice. Because every time you explain yourself when you didn't need to, every time you speak out of fear instead of clarity, you reinforce the belief that who you are needs to be softened to be accepted. But that belief, it's not yours. It was planted in you. Maybe you were taught, directly or indirectly, that your needs were a burden, that your feelings were inconvenient, that your presence needed to be managed, curated, controlled. And so you did. You became the peacemaker, the one who smooths the rough edges, the one who avoids conflict, even if it means erasing yourself in the process. You learn to be easy to love by making yourself easier to swallow. But what if you stopped? What if you allowed yourself to just say, "I'm tired," without the follow-up speech? What if you said no, and let that be the whole sentence? What if you felt something deeply and didn't try to explain why? What would happen? Would someone leave? Would they get angry? Would they judge you? Maybe. But maybe you'd finally see who's really there for you, not for the version of you who bends to fit. Maybe you'd feel discomfort, yes, but you'd also feel free. Because over-explaining isn't just exhausting. It's a slow form of self-abandonment. And you've done that long enough. You don't have to narrate your every move. You don't have to wrap your truth in a bow for someone else to accept it. You don't have to explain your boundaries to people who never respected them to begin with. The moment you stop over-explaining is the moment you begin reclaiming. Reclaiming your time, your energy, your voice. Reclaiming the self you were before the fear crept in and convinced you that being misunderstood was a danger you couldn't survive. But here you are, still breathing, still standing, still longing for more than a life spent explaining yourself to people who never really listened. So what happens when you stop? You meet yourself, the real you, the one beneath the disclaimers and footnotes, the one who doesn't need to be explained to be worthy. And that's where everything starts to change. Silence can feel like punishment. It can feel like rejection, like retreat, like failure. Especially when you've spent your whole life believing that to be heard is to be safe, to be loud is to be alive. But what if silence isn't what you thought it was? What if silence, when chosen, not forced, isn't weakness at all? What if silence can be strength? What if it can be self-respect? There is a difference, and it matters. There's the silence that comes from fear, the kind where you swallow your truth to avoid confrontation, where you go quiet, not because you want to, but because speaking feels too dangerous. That kind of silence is suffocating. It's the silence of walking on eggshells, of disappearing slowly to keep the peace. It's the silence that wraps around your throat like a knot you can't untie. And it drains you. Day by day, word by word, it steals your voice. But then, there's another kind of silence, a sacred kind, the silence that comes from choice, the silence that says, enough. I no longer need to explain. I no longer need to prove myself. This is my boundary. This is my line. Carl Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. True healing doesn't come from pretending everything is fine. It doesn't come from saying the right things, from talking circles around your pain. It comes from sitting in the quiet, from facing the parts of yourself you were taught to hide, from saying with a calm voice, "This is who I am, and that's enough." Imagine this. One day, you stop typing out long messages trying to explain your feelings. You stop preparing your defense. You stop offering disclaimers before you speak. And instead, you just say, "I need space. I need rest." And nothing more. That moment, simple, quiet, terrifying, is the moment you finally begin to live. Because that moment isn't about pushing people away. It's about pulling yourself back home. It's about recognizing that your energy is sacred, that your peace matters, and that you don't have to sacrifice either to keep people comfortable. This silence is not cold. It's not harsh. It's clear. It says, I'm not angry. I'm not hiding. I'm just done performing. It says, I'm not shutting down. I'm showing up for myself. It says, I've explained enough. And now, I choose to simply be. There is dignity in that. A quiet dignity that doesn't need applause or understanding. A kind of self-respect that doesn't make announcements. It just exists. So the next time you feel the urge to explain, to over-clarify, to fill the silence with justification spores, ask yourself, am I speaking from fear, or am I allowed to be quiet? Because I've said enough. And if the answer is, I've said enough, then that moment, right there, is your turning point. Because silence, when rooted in self-love, becomes your protection, your anchor, your truth. Not every story needs to be explained. Not every feeling needs to be translated. And not every boundary needs a speech. Sometimes, your silence is the loudest declaration of your worth. Sometimes, it's the only language your soul needs to finally feel heard. There's a kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep can fix. It's not in your body. It's in your soul. It's what happens when you explain yourself too much. When you give too much. When you try too hard to be understood by people who were never really listening. Every word you offer as a defense. Every sentence you craft to avoid being misunderstood. Every justification you whisper just to feel safe. It drains you. Because explaining isn't just speaking. It's emotional labor. It takes real energy from the deepest part of you. The part that should be used to create, to feel, to love, to rest. Carl Jung described psychic energy as something like electricity flowing, dynamic, alive. But like electricity, it needs boundaries. It needs containers. It needs intention. When that energy is scattered, when it leaks through constant explanations and efforts to manage others' perceptions, it doesn't just disappear. It turns against you. You feel depleted, uninspired, numb. Not because you did too much, but because you gave too much of yourself away in places that didn't honor you. Think about it. Every time you defended a boundary you already knew was valid. Every time you replayed a conversation in your head, wondering what you could have said differently. Every time you dimmed your light just a little, just enough to avoid confrontation. You lost something, a small piece of your inner fire. And over time, the spark dims. The clarity fades. The voice inside you becomes quieter and quieter until one day, you realize you haven't heard it in weeks. That's what happens when you explain too much. But here's the truth. You don't need to argue. You don't need to convince. You don't need to prove. You need to preserve your light, your peace, your clarity. Imbalance doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. It's the silence after a long explanation that leaves you feeling worse, not better. It's the weight in your chest after overthinking a simple moment. It's the quiet resentment that builds when you abandon yourself for the sake of keeping the peace. But what if you stopped? What if, instead of explaining, you paused, you took a breath, and chose not to respond right away, not to defend, not to justify, not to shrink, just to be still? In that pause, something powerful happens. You begin to call your energy back, not with anger, not with blame, but with intention. You begin to notice. What conversations nourish you? What spaces drain you? Where are you giving too much of your inner electricity and getting nothing in return? And when you start to see it clearly, you can do the most radical thing. Protect your energy like your life depends on it. Because it does. Not in the dramatic sense, but in the slow, steady, daily way that determines the shape of your spirit. The way you show up in the world. The way you feel in your own skin. So let yourself pull back. Not because you're cold. Not because you're passive-aggressive. But because you're healing. You're choosing to reserve your power. To keep your light burning where it matters most. Inside you, there is wisdom in restraint. There is strength in silence. And there is freedom in no longer needing to explain your every step. So here it is, a new way of living. Impersonal noise fades. Stillness returns. Energy regenerates. You stop pouring out and start filling in. Imbalance becomes balance. Confusion becomes clarity. Chaos becomes calm. Silent. I see clearly. I don't need to explain. And finally, I'm home. Some relationships are built on effort. Others are built on exhaustion. If you constantly find yourself explaining who you are, what you feel, why you need what you need again and again, it's not love. It's a transaction, a performance, a plea for recognition. But real connection doesn't ask you to perform. It doesn't make you prove your worth through carefully crafted words. It doesn't demand that you soften your voice or shrink your truth just to be heard. It meets you in silence. It sees you in stillness. Because someone who truly loves you doesn't need subtitles for your soul. They don't need endless explanations. They feel you. They notice your pauses. They listen between the words. And when you say, "I need space," they don't panic. They understand. When you say, "I'm quiet today," they don't take it personally. They offer presence, not pressure. That's the difference. That's the standard. Because the truth is harsh, but it's freeing. The person who doesn't want to understand you never will. Not because you're too complex. Not because you're too emotional. But because they never intended to listen deeply in the first place. You can explain it in different ways. You can speak slowly, clearly. You can beg with your eyes, cry with your voice. But if someone is committed to misunderstanding you, it won't matter. It will never be enough. That's not your failure. That's their choice. And the longer you stay in spaces where your truth has to be translated, the further you drift from yourself. Because explaining constantly isn't connection, it's erosion. It wears you down. It chips away at your trust. It makes you second-guess your intuition, your needs, your knowing. But when you're with someone aligned, something shifts. You don't need to clarify the tone of your voice. You don't need to justify the rhythm of your emotions. You don't need to defend your boundaries, because they aren't trying to decode you. They're trying to hold you. That's what real love does. It creates room. It doesn't tighten the space. It listens without interruption. It accepts without interrogation. If someone always makes you feel like your emotions are a debate to be won, leave. If they only hear you when you're at your breaking point, walk away. If you have to turn yourself into a version of yourself they can digest, that's not intimacy. That's erasure. Because you were not meant to live on trial. You were not meant to constantly justify your existence. You were not meant to beg for peace in spaces that refuse to offer it. It's not because you're asking for too much. It's because they're giving too little. So remember this. It's not that you're too complicated. It's that they never tried to understand. It's not that your feelings are too loud. It's that they were never really listening. It's not that you're hard to love. It's that they only knew how to love conditionally. You don't need someone who tolerates your depth. You need someone who honors it. So stop explaining. Let your silence speak for you, and let the wrong ones fade. There comes a moment quiet, simple, without announcement when something inside you shifts. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in clarity. You stop reaching. You stop arguing. You stop explaining. And in that stillness, something sacred begins. Because silence isn't emptiness. It isn't weakness. It's the beginning of emotional freedom. You're no longer living to be understood. You're living to be true. And that changes everything. It's not about shutting people out. It's not about building walls or going numb. It's about honoring the voice inside you, the one that has whispered for years beneath the noise of your apologies. One day, you don't respond with a long message. You don't replay the conversation in your head. You don't explain why you said no. You just say it and let it be. That day, everything changes. You feel a strange kind of peace, maybe for the first time in your life. Not because someone else gave it to you, but because you finally stopped giving pieces of yourself away just to feel seen. You realize that being quiet doesn't make you invisible. It makes you whole. You realize that choosing silence doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're grounded, rooted in who you are, no longer bending to be understood by those unwilling to see. And from that silence, you begin to hear something new. Not the echo of your fear, not the voice of doubt, but your truth, clear, indéniable. And finally, yours. You don't need to convince anyone. You don't need to fix what they never cared to understand. You don't need to decorate your pain with logic. You just need to be. Because silence, when chosen with love, not fear, is the highest act of self-respect. It says, I believe myself even when you don't. It says, I know my worth, even when you forget it. It says, I don't need to explain my soul for you to find it worthy. That's not isolation. That's liberation. That's not a wall. That's a boundary. And in that space, quiet, tender, unshaken, you begin the journey home. To yourself. To the part of you that remembers what it felt like to be at peace. To the part of you that no longer begs, no longer performs, no longer edits who you are for someone else's comfort. You are not here to be understood by everyone. You are here to be true to yourself. And if that means fewer words, fewer people, fewer explanations, so be it. Because what you gain in return is everything. Stillness, clarity, power, peace. So take a breath. Let the noise fall away. And ask yourself, what would your life feel like if you didn't have to explain who you are? What would change if you trusted your truth enough to say less and mean more? If you've ever felt like you had to explain yourself too much, share that moment in the comments. Because only when you stop speaking for the sake of being understood, can you finally hear the voice that matters most, your own. And if this message reached something quiet and tender within you, like a voice you almost forgot, don't forget to like this video. Subscribe to the channel, because this journey back to yourself is not one you have to walk alone. We're walking it together. One breath, one boundary, one quiet, powerful silence at a time.